Did you ever watch a movie called Ferris Bueller's Day Off? Well, if you didn't, you should have. Go out and get it right away. It's an excellent comedy. It's from back in the 90s. And it's about a kid that pretends to be sick, and he ditches school for a day. And one of the memorable scenes from it, really, was one of the teachers who was doing roll call when Ferris Bueller wasn't there. And he kept saying, Bueller, Ferris, and then he kept calling his name, and Bueller. And, of course, he wasn't answering because he wasn't there. Well, did you know that your computer also does a roll call? It sure does. But what happens here with your computer is there's something there, a piece of firmware, really, that's called the BIOS. Really, firmware is programming that's kind of integrated into circuits. It's not software that you would run in the traditional sense. It's kind of hard-baked into the circuits. And one form of firmware is the BIOS. And now let's take a look at what it is and what it's used for. When you're starting the computer, there's a process called the bootstrap process. This is also known just as boot or booting the computer if you want to make a verb from it. Anyway, when you boot that computer, it goes through several steps. One of those would be the power on self-test. This is simply part of that roll call. Your computer goes through each major device, probably not all the minor, tiny little things you might have installed, but all the major things, memory, processor, some of the other biggies, and it goes through those things just to see, hey, are you there? And if you're there, identify yourself. You know, that's kind of what it's doing, and it's also checking for basic functionality. So if one of those devices has, burnt out or has some kind of a problem, that will be noted usually in the post. You'll see it on the screen. The other thing it just initializes each component and makes it available for the rest of the system to use. The BIOS, or the basic input-output system, is what's at the core of a lot of this as far as doing the roll call. And again, it just identifies and verifies each component. Sometimes you might hear this called the CMOS. That's really an old way of describing this. This just stands for complementary metal oxide semiconductor. And it's just a reference to the physical media that the programming used to be stored on. It was a certain kind of a semiconductor, but we don't really have those anymore. We don't use those. We use different kinds of storage, but sometimes people still call it the CMOS. Now, the BIOS that you have installed on your computer, you don't install that. It's not like something that you next finish your way through an installation like if you're installing Office or some other program. This is all installed already on the motherboard from the manufacturer. Okay, so when you first open up that computer and power it on, that stuff's already been done right there. However, you may need to access that BIOS. There are various settings and configurations that you can make from within it. So in order to do that, when you power on the computer, if you watch the monitor very carefully, you should see a message, usually somewhere close down to the bottom, that'll say press any key, or it might say usually press F2 or the delete key, or any other instructions that it'll show you on the screen. All the manufacturers are different with this. So just press whatever key that is. Now, if you're like me, you'll see the message, you'll try to hit the key, and you miss it. And it still just boots into Windows. If that's the case, you just have to restart the computer and try your luck again, okay? So I have missed that little prompt many, many times. And on this computer that I'm using now, for some reason, I faithfully press F2 or delete. It still doesn't always do it. I don't know why. But anyway, sometimes you have to give it multiple tries. There's also something called the Unified Extensible Interface, or UEFI. And this is actually a couple of things. Number one, it's just a more modern form of the BIOS. The BIOS itself is kind of old. The UI for it, in other words, the way you make your way around in the side of that programming, is just by arrow keys and pressing enter, stuff like that. And I think you press F10 to save your settings and escape to get out of the settings, okay? So that's how we used to do it in the old BIOS days. This is kind of becoming an older term. Now, UEFI is most likely to be found on any new computer. Some UEFI systems will give you the option to go back to an old BIOS UI if you prefer that. Hardly anybody does. I don't know why you would want to do that. But the UEFI, you can use your keyboard and mouse. And like I said before, it's just a more modern BIOS. Also provides better security, and it may provide access to something called the Trusted Platform Module chip, which is really not access. It's really more of a way of enabling or disabling it. And later on, if you continue on in your IT career, you'll see various ways that can be used. Various types of certificates or other cryptographic material that's very security sensitive can be stored there. Also, keys that unlock your computer, unlock your hard drive so that you can decrypt a BitLocker encrypted drive, for example. That may also be stored in the Trusted Platform Module module. Anyway, there's also keyboard mouse UI like I told you about a moment ago. Also, it's usually best not to make changes to all of these settings. Usually out of the box, everything usually works just fine, so you don't have to turn anything on. And if you decide to get more advanced, you might change some things, okay? So, for example, on the motherboard that I'm using, a lot of gamers like the motherboard, and the brand that I use, Asus, is very much a gamer's favorite. And so well, you could do things such as overclocking. So let's say, that, for example, that my CPU is designed to work at 3.2 gigahertz. I don't even remember what mine really is, but let's just say it's 3.2. You can overclock that, and what that does is it shoots more voltage into it, and it's kind of like in the Fast and Furious movies where they say they're not going fast enough, and so they open up the valve on the nitrous, and all of a sudden the car just goes, flies across canyons, jumps from one skyscraper, crashes through the window in the adjacent skyscraper, all that kind of stuff. That stuff really happens, Anyway, so that's kind of what happens here is when you overclock, you apply more voltage, and there's some other tricks that happen as well. And now maybe, I don't know how far this could go, but let's say now we got 3.6 or 3.9. Or if it's like a Fast and Furious movie, 1,000 gigahertz or something. I don't know. Anyway, so we just are able to kind of goose the speed of those processors. Now, that also does have a disadvantage you should be aware of, and I don't want to get too far into it now because it's not our topic. That causes it to get very hot. That's why a lot of gamers have massive heat sinks on top of their processors, why they use liquid cooling, and why they have extra fans inside the case of their computer. Now, any unwanted changes that you make, sometimes if you poke around in there, you might realize, oops, I made a mistake somewhere. Now the Windows won't even boot. What did I do? Well, you can usually reset back to defaults, and those are usually very safe settings. And so if you kind of get lost or you hurt yourself somehow, you can usually get back to those default settings and get yourself a bootable system. Don't ask me how I know about that, by the way. Anyway, you do also sometimes need to update it. Normally from within these, do I have it in here? The UEFI versions of BIOS. Normally it can tell if there's a new version, or you may just go, once you've booted into Windows, go to the website of the manufacturer, download the latest version of the BIOS. Somewhere in the screen when you're accessing the UEFI and the BIOS settings, it'll say what version is, version 1.5.6 or whatever. And then you can go to the vendor's website and see what's the latest version. It might be 1.5.9. So there might have been a couple of updates there. Now you can download that and apply that. Usually you'll see that where to do that from within the UEFI/BIOS settings. Some people are of the persuasion that if it's not broken, don't fix it. Favorite saying of my dad. But anyway, if it's not broken, don't fix it. So some people don't want to update. If everything seems to be working fine, a lot of us people like to tweak the motherboard and get the actual, the very last ounce of performance out of things and the latest updates, so we might update more frequently than that. Oh, by the way, let me show you this. I didn't intend on this. Did you notice that each one of these bullets starts with a U? Wow. I should have been a preacher or something like that. But amazingly, and without intending to, they all start with U. That won't be on any tests or quizzes or anything like that. I just wanted you to see how clever I am. And then before I close here, see, I could have been a preacher. Anyway, before we're done here, I do want you to see just an example. I can't really record this screen because this all loads before the operating system, so it would load also before any recording software could be loaded. But this is just a page from the manufacturer's website for my particular model. Most computers these days will look somewhat similar to this. And if I zoom in a bit here so you can kind of get some more detail. Remember I was telling you earlier that you're going to get a BIOS version. That's how you can tell what the current version is and compare that to whatever the most current version is, for example. We get some basic hardware information here. Information about the CPU temperature. Looks like it's 36C in this screenshot that they took. I was mentioning overclocking. You can go over here, and it was just the arrows here, jolt that up a little bit higher and higher and higher until once again, yeah, you're flying across canyons and stuff. Anyway, jumping down here, you can see we've got some fans running. Remember again, especially if you're overclocking, people usually put a lot of fans in their computer and a giant heatsink. And then this is what I also wanted to show you. If you get yourself in trouble, notice that you can hit this default F5 item to load the optimized default settings. It's almost always guaranteed to be a bootable system if you've misconfigured some settings in the BIOS that have prevented it from operating properly. Alright, that's it for this nugget. That's all about the BIOS, the UEFI, the CMOS, if you want to use a really old term. I hope this nugget has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing. In previous nuggets, we've been discussing the processor quite a lot, and we've mentioned the importance of it in terms of performance. Generally speaking, the faster the processor, the faster the overall performance of your computer. However, there's certain bottlenecks that can occur also, specifically if you don't have enough memory. So if you don't have enough memory, that causes a second problem where you're going to have more disk activity, which I'll describe here coming up. And when that occurs, your overall system will slow down, and at some points, it almost doesn't even matter how fast your processor is. But first, let's go ahead and take a look at memory itself. So first of all, when it comes to your memory, you need to install it in the motherboard in a certain way. And you can see in this manual for, again, what I'm pointing to here is my own motherboard. We don't know necessarily right at the outset if we're going to have a single memory module like this, or whether we're going to have two, or whether we're going to have four, like we have right here. Notice that those are your only choices. You're not going to have 1, 2, or 3. It's going to be 1, 2, or 4. And that's just kind of the nature of the way the bus is handled and the way the motherboard is configured. But if you have just a single memory module, you can't just install it in whichever one of these you want. Notice that it specifically identifies this first slot, which is identified as DIMM A2, as where you have to install that memory. Similarly, with only two, you can only install it in the very first slot in each one of these sets right here, DIMM A2 and DIMM B2. And if you have all four, then of course you just fill them all up. Also, I'll point out when you install those, they'll usually snap into place pretty definitively once that happens. And there's little levers on the side that pop into place to hold them into place. But that's at least the physical orientation of the memory and where they go again on your motherboard. Now let's take a look at a few other things about memory. What is it really? Well, it's just fast live data. So when I open up maybe an application that's been installed on my hard drive, it has to load into memory. Most of it's going to be in memory and dynamically operating there. When I open up files, most of those files, like a Word document, this PowerPoint presentation that we're looking at right now, that's loaded somewhere in my memory here, okay? And so that's live data. What I mean by that is that it's only available in these memory modules. That's what we call these memory modules, while the computer power is turned on. Whereas, of course, if I have a hard drive or a solid-state disk drive, when the power is off on that computer or laptop or whatever it is, then, of course, that data still remains there. This means that since it's only available really when the PC is on, then there's a potential here for lost data. Just to be aware of that, because I might have a Word document, loaded into memory here, and if suddenly, I just got a cat and he's kind of tearing up my office. The other day he actually was playing with a circuit breaker on the back of my battery backup down here, which controls all my power, and might be more information you want to know. But he pressed on the circuit breaker and it turned off the power to all of my computers, these lights, my camera, everything, and I lost some data because it was stored here just in memory and I hadn't had a chance to save it yet. That's what I get for getting a cat, I guess. My dog never does that kind of shenanigan. Anyway, that's cats for you. So one of the best upgrades also for performance is going to be, again, memory. Because when that happens, you can load more applications in. So for example, in machines that have there's kind of starved for memory, you might only be able to load one or two major applications, and then if you load much more than that, the system can freeze. It might take too long for things to happen. You might see the kind of little spinning wait circle that occurs on various operating systems. And it could get to be a real frustration, but with more memory, you can open up more apps really without any consequence. I've got 64 gigabytes of RAM on this computer, and I can pretty much open anything I want to, and I don't really notice a difference in performance, or at least a slowdown in performance. Also, when you have plenty of memory, it's going to be able to handle larger active files. So again, I work with a lot of photographs, panoramas and stuff like that, and some of those can get to be quite large. So I might open up a document here, panorama, that's maybe a gigabyte in size. That's really a lot for a single file. And sometimes I might open multiple files that work like that. And so now I've got 2 gigabytes or 3 gigabytes worth of only files loaded into memory. If I don't have enough memory for the complicated applications that are large applications that I run and all of the data, then there's going to be a problem that occurs. And that's what we see when we have insufficient memory. So when that happens, let's say that, I'm going to kind of use a full meter here, okay? So this is 0 in memory, and this is full in memory. And if I'm opening up lots and lots and lots and lots of things, and it gets to be pretty close to full in memory, and I open up another big file, another gigabyte-sized file, then what's going to happen? There's not enough memory to load all of that. So what it does, Windows is capable of doing this. Most operating systems have some similar functionality to this. What happens here is it says, I don't have enough memory here, but I'm kind of embarrassed to your computer's embarrassed to admit it doesn't have enough memory. So it says, I want to shuffle off, instead of using it on memory, I want to put it on your hard drive. You'll never know the difference. Yes, you will. Because what's faster? This memory or the hard drive? Remember, hard drive, at least in the fundamental sense, it's a bunch of hard disk drives. It's a bunch of spinning metal platters that require an arm to go back and forth on like a record player to read and write the data. That is probably thousands of times slower than what we have with memory. So you're much better to keep it in memory if you can. So if I don't have enough memory, maybe I only had, let's say, 4 gigabytes of memory here. Well, that's kind of terrible. That's really not very much memory by today's standards, right? So almost any new machine should have at least 16 gigabytes, but let's say I had 4. Now if I upgrade to 16 gigabytes, buy a little bit more memory, then it's not going to do this thing where it swaps out to my hard disk drive. And then it's going to keep it in memory, give me much better performance. By the way, this process where it kind of says, hey, I'm kind of embarrassed, I don't have enough space in my memory to store the file you just opened, so I'm going to just put it on the hard drive. That thing is called swapping, okay? And what we have here is a special file called a swap file, and there's, depending on the operating system, it might be called something different. But this swap file, or paging file, as it's also called within Windows, simulates that it's actually memory. When it's really not, it's just going to slow down because it's on a hard disk. And now let's take a look at the various types of memory. Well, first of all, memory by itself, it's generally called dynamic RAM, especially the older versions of memory. That's just kind of, one of the OG types of memory, one of the original types of memory. What has to happen with this is, like I said before, it has to be kept on in order to retain that data. And what will happen is, if you have data that's in memory, regardless of what type it is, then before you turn off the computer, you better have saved it to the hard drive. Otherwise, you've lost that data, okay, for any open files or something like that. So anyway, it has to be constantly refreshed to keep the data in these cells, but this is kind of largely obsolete. I can't remember when. It seems like back in the 90s, late 90s maybe, this was starting to kind of go off the scene. Nowadays, though, we have something different called synchronous DRAM, or SDRAM. And that's a little bit more modern, but that's also kind of getting obsolete. What happens with this, though, and here's how it's different, is that it synchronizes its timing with the system bus, so that every time data can synchronize on the system bus, it will then also read or write data to the RAM. This is 64 bits wide, and so it's able to handle, pretty kind of a 64-lane highway data to and from that RAM. But now there's going to be a more current kind of a memory called DDR RAM. DDR SDRAM is what we really call it. That's double data rate RAM. It kind of gives you a double pump of data. So what happens here is, normally this one right here I just described, it will read or write data on one cycle to the system bus. But this one will be able to double pump the data because it reads and writes at the start of data and at the end of the clock cycle. So at the start and the end of the clock cycle. So you kind of get a 2-for-1 sale on the amount of data that gets written there. There's several different versions of this, DDR2, DDR3, DDR4. Most is DDR4 at the time of this recording. And then also be aware that there is a difference in the form factor between a desktop type of memory, which is the same form factor that we use in servers. We just might put more in a server because they'll usually have more slots, more available slots for you to insert memory into, and then also from a laptop, which uses a small outline dual inline memory module. Okay, so that's what SO means there, is small outline. It's just a smaller form factor. But let's go ahead and take a look at how some of this looks now. And for that, I've simply gone to Corsair's website. You can see it up here in the corner, Corsair.com. There's a number of other manufacturers as well. You could also go to Kingston Memory. You can just Google for that. Crucial.com is another one you could go to. You can Google for that as well. But it's Crucial.com. A lot of other manufacturers. Corsair is really known for and really good with gaming hardware. So that would be gaming memory, gaming. They have really good heat sinks that are liquid cooled that you can cool off your processor with. So I've got quite a bit of really cool stuff here. And a lot of gamers really like these LEDs. I don't know if you can tell. You probably can tell by looking. But if you look at the website here, these 4 things here on the left and right of the processor, those are Memory modules. There's another picture of the memory modules. Okay, these are lit up with LEDs. A lot of gamers just really like those things. I guess they like to game with flair. Anyway, so let's take a look at some of the memory modules that you might see here. These are going to be optimized for gaming and performance, but the overall form factor is going to be the same even in a business desktop. Probably won't have the pretty lights on it, but the overall function, again, is going to be pretty much the same. Your memory can also be overclocked. I've mentioned overclocking in a previous nugget, but your memory, as well as your processor, can be overclocked. Now let's go ahead and take a look, as I clicked on that one, at some of these memory modules, and you'll just give you an idea of what they look like. Here's a photograph of them installed, and like I said before, when you press these down in there, you can't really see it very well because it's kind of a dark picture, but there's these flip levers here on both sides that click into place. And then to remove it, you press down on those same levers both at the same time, and then that memory module will pop out. Do notice that, as I go to a different photograph here, that they have these heat shields on them. Sometimes those are also called heat spreaders. It helps to dissipate the heat away from the little chips that are on the surface of this circuit board. However, the other thing that they prevent is accidental static charge. So when you handle these as a gamer, if you're installing some of these in your computer, or as anybody, really, not a gamer, anybody, when you install those, if they don't have the heat spreaders on there and some of the cheaper ones don't, you could touch one of the black memory chip looking things. And if you do that, even without feeling it, you could have enough electricity in your body to hit a static charge on there, and it'll ruin that chip, thereby ruining the whole memory module. So these covers that they have on there help to prevent from that. Also, do notice this, as I kind of move my way around here, there are notches here for the levers that I talked about. Those notches for those levers will lock into place here, holding the memory in place. And here is the center notch right here, just a gap in the teeth right here, that will ensure that you can only install it in a certain orientation. I don't know if you want to count these or not, but there are fewer gold lands on this side than there are on this side. This is a longer section over here, and because of that offset orientation, you can't put it in backwards. Because in the slot, there's a corresponding notch that fits only in that little spot right there. And then here's kind of a top-down view of how it looks. Again, you don't have to have the little LED lighting on there. It sure is pretty, but at the very least, it kind of gives you a good visual on where that memory goes. All right, and then backing out here a little bit, I'm going over here to laptop and notebook memory. I don't know if you're really going to be able to tell by looking at these, but these SODIMMs here, or small outline modules that we see right here that I talked about earlier, they are just a smaller form factor. I don't want to say they're not quite half as small in terms of the overall width compared to a normal memory module. And that's just a rough guess. If you looked at it, you would see that it's much smaller. Also, this again is offset in the notch so that you cannot install it incorrectly. Also, with laptops, you don't have as many slots to put your memory in. Okay, on desktop computers, most of the time you're going to see 4 or 8. Okay, just like one of the pictures we saw there had 8. That's plenty of memory there. But on a laptop, usually you're going to have 1 slot or 2, and for both desktop and notebook memory, usually you're going to wind up with memory capacities where each one of these modules might be 4 gigabytes, maybe it's going to be 8 gigabytes or 16 gigabytes. Those are the most common sizes. So on my laptop, and if it has 2 slots in it, I can install 2 16 gigabyte modules like this and then have a total of 32 gigabyte in that computer. So that's it for memory modules. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing. In previous nuggets, we've taken a look at various components of computer hardware, and I've kind of had to address what some of those things are as we go, just so that we have some sense of context. But in this particular nugget, I want to get into some more detail about the actual items that we've looked at there. Now, well, first of all, let's talk about a main difference in memory. Okay, we talked about memory earlier here in this course. If you haven't seen that, go ahead and take a look at that information. But here what we'll be taking a look at, first of all, is RAM. We really want to address the difference between volatile and non-volatile memory. So we talked about RAM before. That is memory. Random access memory is what that acronym stands for. So here it referred to as memory, or you'll hear it referred to as random access memory, or RAM. Here's what a memory module might look like. We've seen that graphic before, and it's just got these little chips on it. They are electrically charged, And as long as they're holding that electrical charge, they will retain the data that's put in them by the user sending data to it through a program usually. Maybe it's got storing a file, maybe it's storing executable instructions, some kind of a program is loaded in there, Microsoft Word, Excel, Power, who knows what else. Okay, so that's all in there, but it's only useful and valid at the time that the power is on. So again, it's going to require constant power. Now, one of the concerns that's always been there with computing is that if you lose power or if the computer locks up, I don't know if you've seen that before, I'm sure you have if you've ever run Windows. Locks up, so meaning that you're just going about your business, you're trying to type a letter, you're trying to do your work, whatever it is, you're browsing the internet, and all of a sudden, the mouse just gets locked right on the screen, and you can't move. No matter how much you move it on the screen, on the desktop, it won't move. No matter what you type on the keyboard, nothing happens. Usually, the only recourse there is to just power off the computer. That's possibly the worst thing you can do, but it's the lesser of two evils, really. Because it's either that or sit there and do nothing, right? So you might have had a file here, for example, resident in memory at this time when the power goes down or the machine locks up or whatever happens. Now whatever was there is not going to be saved. Now, just as a quick FYI, many applications, such as Microsoft Word or any of the Microsoft products, really kind of automatically assume that something bad could happen. So there's kind of this backup plan, if you will, where they'll save the file temporarily in a kind of a temporary file. A lot of times it'll start with a tilde. That's that symbol that you'll see. On my keyboard, it appears above the tab, and you have to hit Shift. It's right above the, I guess that would be a backtick symbol. Anyway, so that appears on the keyboard, but you don't have to know where that is. All I'm saying is there will sometimes be a file with that name and then whatever the name of the file is, .doc or something like that. And then when you restart the computer and you open Word again, it will say, hey, this file didn't get closed down properly last time. You want to recover that? Or some words to that effect, and allows you to recover that to usable form. But there could still be some data that is missing from that. So again, if you lost power, if the machine locked up, any of those bad things happened, then you could lose that data that was in memory. But that doesn't mean that RAM is bad. The reason why we have this is because it's necessary in order to have the instruction set that we need to be sent to the processor that loads the programs that are going to then instruct the processor with what to do. It's going to store our files for temporarily, so it's not really a long-term storage. It's just going to hold them there while the power is on and while we're using those files. And then it's just going to be gone when the power's off or when we close that program or close the files. But one of the advantages of memory is that it's fast, but it's temporary, okay? Now, that's all right, because we do have a permanent storage for our files as well. And I say permanent, it's permanent until you decide to delete the files or the programs. Now, the thing that's going to actually store the data in a permanent fashion is going to be non-volatile devices, such as a hard disk drive or a solid-state disk. Those sorts of things are going to be what's going to be able to store it permanently. At least that is until you decide to delete it, delete the file, or delete the program, or whatever it is. In other words, the only reason for power is so that you can read or write to that device, and if there's a loss of power or if the computer freezes or something like that, then there's no lost data provided you've already saved it. This is known as persistency as well, or persistent data. There's various comparisons out there on, the internet in terms of how fast memory is compared to a hard disk drive. But the hard disk drive is noticeably slower. It is definitely going to be slower, but again, it's permanent storage. So it's not that it's bad. You should just be aware of the fact that it's not as fast as RAM. But again, it's not that you use one or the other, you use both. So for example, if I have my file here in RAM, that's all well and good. I'm typing away, I'm happy with my work, whatever. Everybody's happy here. And then when I think of it, I will save that file to my hard drive. Once I've done that, it is now permanently stored on that drive until I decide to delete it. And now let's take a look at characteristics of hard disk drives, which we usually just abbreviate HDD or hard disk drive like that. The characteristics of these are, it's going to be relatively inexpensive per gigabyte. Okay, there's other ways of storing data besides a hard disk drive. We could use some other things I'm going to be talking about coming up, such as a solid state drive or a thumb drive, for example. But those are usually more expensive. So if you're looking for economy and reasonable performance, especially just at a desktop level, then you're probably going to want to just use hard disk drives. Inexpensive, but lots of storage comparatively. It's magnetic media, so it actually uses magnetic signals to store data on that drive. The data is actually going to be read by heads, like you can see right here. This is just a photograph I took actually a few years ago. And this head right here, you can kind of think of like a record player. As it spins around, as the record spins around, the needle reads the data off of the record. Similarly here, this head will read data off of the magnetic media. Also, there's usually a head on both sides of the platter, so we can see the top side up here, but there's also probably a head on the bottom side reading the underside of that disc as well. And also, this arm right here, you know, unlike a record player, which is just governed by where the grooves are on a record, do any of you know what records are? You know, maybe I'm dating myself. We don't use records anymore. We just download stuff, right? Anyway, so it's governed by the grooves, and as it gets closer and closer to the end of the record, the needle moves closer and closer to the center of the record. However, this can dance around. It can move around a little bit on this disc. Okay, so it's a combination of the spinning as well as the arm being able to move back and forth across the surface. Now, also, as you can see in this photograph, there's usually multiple platters in there. That looks like there's maybe 3. Can't really see. There might be another one down there. I think there's 3 in that one. And with that, you're able to increase the amount of total storage in that hard disk drive. This is also a spinning disk that spins at various speeds. I'll show you that here in a moment. But it's kind of interesting to see if you ever go to a trade show where they're showing computer stuff. I did see one of these in a clear case one time, and you could actually see this thing moving around, and it was very, very, very fast. The discs were spinning really fast, and that head was moving across the platters very, very fast. It kind of looked like a cat playing with a ping pong ball, just like that, I don't know why I said that. Anyway, so the spinning disc here is going to be housed in a 3.5-inch format for desktop computers. In other words, we can't see the opposite side here, but let's just say that it's going to be 3.5 inches from one edge of the disc clear to the other edge of that disc. And that's what you're usually going to see in terms of the size of them for desktop computers, network attached storage where you have storage arrays that have maybe multiple disks in them, 4 disks, 6 disks, 8 disks, 12. They can start to hold a lot of those disks. But in laptops or places where you want to save space, you're probably going to have 2.5-inch drives. I will emphasize that although you can still find these in laptops, they are starting to appear less frequently in favor of solid state. You can also use either one of these as external storage. I've got a couple attached to my computer right now that are external. They're connected by USB port, and they just are part of the nightly backup that I perform on my computer. So any data that I write to my hard drives every day will then get written to those external drives every night. I have 2 backups. You really only need 1. I'm just that paranoid. The speed is also going to be relative to the RPMs, revolutions per minute. In other words, how many times this goes around the clock face, so to speak, per minute. And the general rates are going to be 5,400 RPMs. You'll also see 7,200, 1,500, and there may be some other oddball speeds that you'll see there, but those are kind of the standardized ones that you'll see in most environments. These, of course, here would be high-performing drive. Now, how big do these hard disk drives get? Well, there's going to be a number of different sizes. If you take a look at Seagate.com, Western Digital, some of the other common drive manufacturers out there, you'll probably be able to see drives that'll still appear in the 500 gigabyte range. They're going to be very inexpensive, and they're starting to not be as common. So you might not see those depending on when you watch this video. They may have already become, extinct. But you can get them usually in terabytes. For desktop purposes, you usually see something like a terabyte is usually plenty for common, like home use, small office, desktops, that sort of thing. So probably a terabyte there, but you might see them as big as 18 terabytes or even larger. As time goes by, these certainly get larger. You might see them 20. And that would be for large storage needs, especially for someone that works a lot with multimedia, video files, that sort of thing. You're probably going to need a lot more storage. The interface that these commonly use at this level is going to normally be a serial ATA interface. This is magnified, so this is not to scale, especially to where I appear on this slide. It's probably, 2.5 inches or so from here to here. This is for power, and then there's a separate cable here for all of the data. And you can see that they also have a notch right here. so that the serial ATA cable cannot be plugged in incorrectly. Some connectors will combine both the power and the data on the same cable to make it easy, but most desktops you'll see the power and data separately. Now let's move on to solid-state drives, or SSDs. Now the characteristics of these are that they are generally more expensive than a hard disk drive per gigabyte. So that's why we don't buy them as much as the hard disk drives, because they're just more expensive. A lot of manufacturers of computers, especially at an entry level or a desktop level, they'll a lot of times not use SSDs so they can get the price point down, so they can get a lower entry point for people that are just getting started or that have really basic computing needs. So the thing with this is it's flash memory, but it's non-volatile. So it's a little bit of kind of the best of both worlds. Remember with our memory chips here, we had these little, chiclets on here that are memory chips. I call them chiclets, I don't know why. Anyway, those memory chips had to have power on constantly in order for them to function and to be of any use. However, a solid-state drive is kind of similar. It also has chips, it doesn't have spinning platters in it, but when the power goes off, it's able to retain that memory or whatever was on there, files or programs, whatever it is. In fact, you can put your whole operating system on one of these things. The reality is, there's not much reason to not want an SSD instead of a hard disk drive, except for that expense. These devices are small, light, and very fast, okay? So, normally, weight doesn't account for too much. Most laptops nowadays are probably going to have some kind of a solid-state drive in them. They don't need to have as much storage as many of the desktop computers, so they can use those SSDs. And one of the manufacturer's selling points for laptops is the lightness of them. So that's why we have MacBook Airs. Okay, just the name Air sounds like it's light as air, right? Also, there's no moving parts there with an SSD, and they're usually in the 2.5-inch form factor, although you can get another form factor, which I'll talk to you about here in a moment. But they're usually in the 2.5 inch. Actually, I have one right over here. Right here, okay? 2.5-inch form factor, okay? This one's, you can see the SATA connections for and for power over there. Also, you can get a lot of devices kind of like this. This is going to have connectors right there for this drive, and you can see exactly where it goes right there. So I just plug this thing in like that. And then I'm able to plug this USB cable into any computer that has a USB-A, and almost everything does. And then I've got an external disk drive, right? Now, another point to make there, by the way, is that did you notice that I only have, let me get this back out again. I only have this. I don't have some kind of power that I supplied to it. That's because all the power that's needed is supplied through the USB cable. These don't require very much power to be able to run. That's another selling point of these things, is that, supposedly at least, they're more environmentally friendly because they require less electricity. Now, you may also see, you'll have to go to various disk drive manufacturers, but you may also see selling points here where they are hybrid hard disk drive and solid-state drives. And the idea there is, if this is the form factor of it, it might have spinning platters in here with a little arm that reads the data and everything like that. But there are also going to be some memory chips on here, some solid-state drive chips on here, these little chiclets, and they will probably store what's most frequently used, and there's some kind of a intelligence that can determine what's going to be most frequently used. Probably open files, applications that you're opening right now, and applications that you haven't opened for 3 months, they're going to be right here. They're going to stay on the hard drive. Files that you haven't accessed for a long time, those are all going to be accessed on the hard drive here as well and remain there probably. But frequently used data, probably going to be in the SSD portion of this. That way, you get a lower price point than a full SSD, but it's probably going to be, because of this right here, a little bit of a higher price point than you would have with a pure hard disk drive. The interface, as I showed you a moment ago, usually going to be serial ATA, but you may also have the new M2 interface that's a PCI Express. We haven't really talked about PCI and what that is, but the slots, the expansion slots on your motherboard, when you plug something into there, those are usually PCI Express slots. And there are two main ones that are in use today. One is pretty wide and that we can use with video cards, for example, and one is kind of narrow, and you can use it with main storage for example, a laptop or a desktop computer. So let's just go ahead and take a look at some of these. I'm at Kingston Technologies website. That would be kingston.com here. And in particular, I'm at their SSD section. And look how happy and productive these people are. See? That's why you should be using SSDs. But let's take a look at a couple of these things. This is just a conventional serial ATA SSD. Probably going to be pretty economically priced. And you can also see that it's got a lower capacity than some other storage devices you might see. For example, this goes from 120 up to 960 gigabytes, not even quite a terabyte. And my guess is it's probably a good value. You're going to get pretty good performance out of it because it's an SSD, but you're not going to pay the same price as you would, of course, if you were storing a full terabyte, 2 terabytes, something like that. Now going back here, let's look at something that's kind of high-end. Here I might have this device. Notice that it says Enterprise SSD. Anytime you see Enterprise, that a lot of times refers to server-based kinds of functions. Has nothing to do with Star Trek, although I kind of wish it did. That would be really cool. But because of the word Enterprise there, that's a giveaway right there that's going to probably be something that would be used in a server room. As I scroll down here, we can see that this is going to be much, much larger. Look, you can get up to 7.68 terabytes on that thing. And the form factor is going to be the same that I showed you earlier with this thing. Well, this is only 500 gigabytes, but this form factor is going to be exactly the same as that. So it's going to be pretty expensive. I'm afraid to even look. All right, I looked anyway, and that was a mistake. Now I know for sure I can't afford that thing. Oh my goodness. Questions? Yes. Do you have a 90% discount code? All right. So as we go back, let's take a look at the M2 form factor. This is quite interesting. Let's go to this first one over here, and you can see how that looks. This would just lay parallel to the motherboard, and you put this section right here in the slot. I looked at that and showed that to you in other nuggets within this course. The advantages are, of course, something small like this is going to be very, very light. It's also going to require less electricity since it's connected to a PCI Express slot that, by the way, will be very, very fast. We haven't talked about the bus speeds and things like that. That's kind of a little bit of a higher level where we'd talk about that more if we were in an A+ course. But just take my word for it. If it's directly connected to the bus there, like a PCI Express card, it's got extremely high throughput capabilities there. This is actually what I've got in the desktop computer that I'm recording with right now, and it's extremely fast. When scrolling down here, it's kind of dark right there, but it's kind of a good picture on how it fits into that slot there. I don't think they show it over here, but a lot of times there's a screw hole there as well that's used to hold it in with a screw. And it must be good because look, after all, look at all the awards and reviews they're getting here. And actually, I'm pleasantly surprised. I decided to go to Amazon to check this out, and I searched against it. You could get the full 1,000 gigabytes, which remember, that's a terabyte, for only $116. That's actually pretty good. So there you have it in more detail, hard disk drive detail and solid state drive detail. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing. In our last nugget, we discussed the difference between volatile and non-volatile storage. Remember, RAM or memory is volatile memory, volatile storage, so that you're going to lose whatever's in there when the power goes off, but non-volatile memory was hard disk drives and solid state drives. And continuing that discussion here, we have another kind of a drive that you might likely to see. That would be a flash drive, also known as a thumb drive. Sometimes we call them colloquially just USB sticks, okay? And maybe a couple of other terms out there. But what you'll see here is going to have characteristics similar to an SSD because they really use the same technology, but they are a smaller capacity normally than a hard disk drive or a solid state drive. That's also because the form factor is going to be smaller than either one of those as well. Now, even though I say that it's a smaller capacity, you'd be surprised how big some of these are getting right now. I'll show you that towards the end here. The flash memory, though, remember, it's non-volatile, so that means that data can get written to those chips that are on the device, and with memory, remember, the power gets turned off, then that whatever's in the contents there will disappear. Whereas with this type of memory, with flash memory, non-volatile memory, the data will remain. Also, there are no moving parts on these as well, and you're going to use a USB connection to make these connections. There could be USB-A. That's going to be by far the most common type of a connection that you'll see there. There's also going to be the USB-C, which is much smaller and more modern, also has a higher throughput. Remember, you can take a USB-C device, like a flash drive, and plug it into a Thunderbolt port and get all of the advantages there of Thunderbolt and USB-C together. And then some of these might also be a combo. I got one that I'm going to show you here coming up. The capacities, they've varied as well. As time goes by, they get larger and larger. Some of the earlier ones are about 4 gigabytes, but right now I've seen them as large as 1 terabyte, which is pretty gigantic for a flash drive. And then let me just talk to you about kind of the main uses of these things. Here's an example of one right here. You can kind of see how, just by me holding it in my hand, how big it is. If I open it, this one has, they all have different form factors. Some of them have fancy little covers on there. Some of them, they're easy to drop also, by the way. Some of them have a little thing that you twist open so that it will then expose this USB-A connection, which I think you can see right there, and that's where you plug into your computer. You can put entire operating systems on these. In fact, this one, I've got it written on there, this one has the Mac operating system on it, okay? I actually can run Mac OS on this from a Windows computer, okay? So that's one of the ways that I can do it. It's kind of geeky, I know. The other thing is, these are just very useful to share data. So if I have some quick files that I want to pass to a friend or a colleague, I'll stick this in my computer, copy some files to it, hand it off to them, and hopefully they're not a company spy or something like that. That, by the way, is also another factor that's an issue with these. These things are prohibited in some locations that are highly secure, because you can put company data on here, confidential information, even government secrets, and then hand them to somebody else, and now they have those secrets. So this is like outlawed. This is a fireable offense in some places that I've been if you're caught with one of these. So beware. Also, another security factor with these is that a lot of hackers will use these to spread viruses. So you might have in your company really good methods for blocking email that has viruses in it, or malicious websites and things like that. So what a malicious person might do is they might just be a visitor in the lobby, and they'll have maybe a couple of these in their pocket with viruses on them or some other kind of spyware, malware, and they'll just kind of leave one right there on the coffee table. And then somebody may come by and say, hey, there's a flash drive. People are always curious. They're going to stick this in their computer and see what's on there. And as soon as they double click on something, they've unleashed a virus internally into their organization. So just a couple things to keep in mind about these things. Very useful, very convenient, and I've got a bunch of them, but there are also some security concerns at times. All right, so I decided to go ahead and take you here to pny.com, and you can see the URL up there, pny.com. They make the USB flash drives for HP. Used to be called Hewlett-Packard in the old days, but they just changed the name to HP many years ago. I guess it's easier to say and spell. Anyway, look at the size of this thing. 1 terabyte in size. This is the largest one I've seen as of this recording. Maybe there's going to be larger ones coming up. Look, it's also USB 3.1, so it's extremely fast. But look at this. It says add to cart. Well, I might like to, but I wonder how much it is. There's no price on here. It's one of those things. If you have to ask, you can't afford it, apparently. Anyway, if I go to Amazon, though, I did look this up on Amazon. 1 terabyte for $164. That's actually pretty good value. I should get a commission for when I show these devices. And then finally, I thought I'd take you to the Western Digital location here, just to show you a combo. I mentioned that there was a combo available as well. You can see on this end that that's going to be a USB-C connector, but on the other end is a USB-A connector right here. And then you can see here that you can use that same flash drive to connect to a phone, like you can see right here, so that this guy can take that beautiful photograph of the guy playing with his dog and upload that onto your USB flash drive, or whatever you want to do. And you can see how that USB-C could connect to a phone or a tablet, for example. And then the other end of this would be able to be the USB-A connection. And if you don't have a USB-C on your laptop, for example, you can just plug in the A side. All right, that's it for this brief nugget. Stick around for the next nugget, where I'm going to talk to you about shiny media. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing. All right, you ready to talk about shiny media? Yeah, shiny media. You can probably guess what that is. It's really any kind of a CD or a DVD or a Blu-ray or any of those types of media. And you can see I just did a quick Google search here for CD media, and you can just see what it's all there. So remember, that's the kind of stuff that we used to put music on and things like this. This is quickly becoming kind of defunct, so I'm going to just be a little bit quick on this particular nugget. So compact discs is what those are, and the basic idea here is it uses a laser to read disk data. There's a couple of different ways that it can read data. It can read pits and lands. A pit, if you just kind of look, if you had microscopic vision, like Superman level of vision, and you could take a look at the thin edge of a CD, for example, there would actually be kind of, I don't want to call it raised like a nub or a kind of a bump, but it's read like that. So there's going to be parts that are depressed down that way and parts that are up that way, and that's kind of how it reads it. It really, some of it's done chemically, and it's read by either being a darker spot or a brighter spot. Anyway, this amounts to kind of on or off. What's that known as? That's right, binary, right? So it reads this in a binary fashion, and that's how it's able to collect the data and assemble whatever it is. You know, if it was music, then a certain combination of these, ons and offs would equal, a C sharp or some kind of a musical note or an instrument, so to speak. So eventually it puts together something meaningful. This is known as CDR initially, write once and then read many. So, this is written, maybe it's a musical CD. It's written one time, and then you pop it into a CD player. Geez, do we even still have those? A CD player, and then it would play music, right? Also, there's a CDRW. You can overwrite the data that way. It's read-write data. That's what RW is, read-write. It's not to be confused with the fast and effective method of reading and writing to a hard disk drive. This would be just more for if you had a CD that had data written to it and you forgot, oh, you know what? I need to overwrite one of those files. Maybe you're a musician. You copied a song to the CDRW and then you realize, oops, you know what? That was the wrong song or the wrong version of that song. So you had to copy a different one over top of it. Well, that would be CDRW there. The capacity generally is 700 megabytes. There's different versions of these that have gone up and down in size. But 700 megabytes is generally where they kind of standardized at. And the purposes, as I kind of implied a moment ago, would be music, software. You can also put these, put games on these and use them in a gaming console. But all of that stuff is pretty old. Okay, I don't even know if you're going to see a CD anywhere anymore. I guess you can still buy music on CDs. I mean, you can. But this largely replaced by downloads, DVDs, Blu-ray, especially for movies. You're going to get DVDs and Blu-rays. For music, we're doing a lot of downloads these days. Actually, a lot of people are going back to vinyl. Yeah, records. That's going to become a big craze now. Some people like the way it sounds better, I guess. And then continuing the discussion of optical discs, we also have DVDs, or digital versatile disc. This is a similar laser and data format as a CD. It's just that you can pack more data on there. You can get higher capacities. 4.7 gigabytes was one of the original sizes, but now you can get them up to 17 gigabytes. And really what it does is, again, if I look at the thin edge of a disc there, now it's able to kind of put a double decker on there, or even more than one layer on here. So you've got this layer of lands, but now you have a higher level of lands, and you got this level of pits, and then a deeper level of pits. So it's kind of able to get like a 2-story or more even on a single media, and that's how they're able to kind of stack the data. There's also read and rewrite versions there as well. And the general purposes for DVDs is going to be movies, software, and games. Again, all of those things are really going to download only. Even a lot of the gaming consoles now, I don't really play games anymore. My son has, all the Xbox and stuff like that. He says they mostly just download stuff. They don't even use discs anymore. The Blu-ray discs is also largely replacing DVDs, especially for the movie side of this. And that's because you can get more data on there. You can get up to 128 gigabytes. I think you can get 4 layers on there. 128 gigabytes. And moreover, the Blu-ray disc is able to support a higher resolution. So you're going to get mostly for movies and games on those. All right, that's your shiny media. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing. All right, when we think about working with a computer, most of us kind of have the mentality of just working with our own computer, your own laptop, your own tablet, whatever that is, your own desktop computer. And the files that we save, we usually save those in documents or something like that. And it's just all we kind of all think of it just locally. That's what we call that, by the way, is local storage of your files, where it's on the same local computer that you're currently working on. But in reality, in the world, that's not really how things work anymore. I mean, you can still keep them locally, but if you're in a corporation, many times your files, although it might give you the illusion that they're being stored locally, they may actually be stored on a server somewhere. And, that's really going to be very important because we have a lot of advantages if the files are stored on a server as opposed to stored just on that one local computer. Now let's take a look at some of the characteristics of a network share and what that might involve. First of all, of course, it's going to require a network connection. So if the file's not stored locally on your own hard drive or your own drive somewhere, on your own laptop or whatever, then where is it going to be? Well, it's going to be on some other computer. And you have to be able to access that. How can you access it? Well, you can't just use telepathy or something like that. You have to use Wi-Fi, which maybe that's the same thing. I don't know, right? But you can use Wi-Fi, which we'll talk about more in upcoming nuggets, or you can use Ethernet, which we talked about also in a previous nugget. You could also even use things like Bluetooth, but that's not really part of this discussion per se. So what we're going to do is you're going to have a network connection, and then because of that, you should be able to access those other files on the other computer, provided it's all been configured properly. So there's a couple of different ways you can work with that. One would be something called peer-to-peer. Now I'll say right from the outset, that is the lesser of these two methods. It doesn't have a lot of advantages. There's some problems that could come up with it. Let me show you what those kind of problems could be here. And for this, I will entertain you with yet more of my wonderful artwork. Let's say that each one of these circles represents somebody's computer. Maybe you're working in a small company or a division within your company. And each one of these computers, you are a logon, let's say to that computer. There's somebody else, maybe someone with hair over here, with a logon to that computer. And this person over here is yet another person, and they have a mohawk, okay? Something like that. I don't know what that is. Looks like a water spigot is feeding water into their head or something. Anyway, let's say that I have a folder here. We're all working together on one project, and we have files in this folder that we all need to access. Now, what are some ways that those people could access those files if we didn't have a network connection? They could take a thumb drive. We've talked about that in the past. A thumb drive, an external hard drive, walk in their flip-flops over to my desktop computer, plug in the USB thumb drive, ask me to copy the files to it. They unplug the thumb drive, they walk back to their desktop, they plug it in, then they start working on the file over on their computer, right? It's a little bit awkward, isn't it? And especially here in Phoenix, if we have to go to another building, you'll melt going across the parking lot. So that's why I said flip-flops. You all wear flip-flops around here. Anyway, but we're all in this office and we want to share the files. So what I could do in Windows, and I can show you how to do this in a moment, is I could share that file. I'll put an SH for share. I'll share that file, and then over our magical Wi-Fi here, or Ethernet, doesn't matter which one, then these other people could access it. Now, here's an issue. In order for this person to access it on a strict peer-to-peer network, I would have to create an account for that user here, okay? I'm going to try to exactly duplicate that person with their mohawk here. So I would create a user account with the same username and password, and I would create another account for this person over here, and I would again have their same username and password as well. Now you can immediately see, I'm sure, a couple of problems here. Number one, in order for me to create a share for these users, I had to get their password. Some people are a little reluctant to give up their logon password, right? And they should be. They're really not the best way to do this. But in order to do that, I'm thinking of a Windows environment initially here, I have to create this share here, and I have to say who I want to be able to access it. So I want this person to be able to access it, and I want this person to be able to access it. Maybe there might be other computers out here and other users that don't want to access that share. So when I create that share, it will use whatever their username and password is here on both of these users, and it just kind of passes those credentials on up to here to my Windows computer, and I can say, yep, it matches, therefore you can access this share. This gets to be complicated. Why is that? Well, let's say that this user down here with the mohawk, their password expired. Okay, so now they have to update to password number 2. All right, and they have now changed their password. So now when they double click on this share, and they can do this over the network, when they double click on the share in something like Windows Explorer or File Explorer, then their access is denied. And then they have to say, hey, I can't access that share. I accessed it yesterday and it was okay. Today when I double click on it, it doesn't even let me open it. And what's happened is, since their password has changed here, I have to change it up here as well. Okay, I have to change it up there too. So now I have to make sure that I change that user's password to password 2. You can see how complicated this gets. It does not scale out. If I had to share that to dozens of users or even hundreds, there'd be no way to keep up with it. I would just have to be changing things constantly in order to make sure that it was still available. Well, that's one of the disadvantages we have with a peer-to-peer network. It's really best if you have just, a couple of computers that you might want to share files with. Even 3 here, I'm not too happy with it. But in a larger corporation, you're definitely not going to be able to use peer-to-peer. In fact, in a lot of organizations, it's actually outlawed. You're not allowed to use peer-to-peer. You have to use a different method here, and that would be the method that we call client-server. The way client-server works, and this will be the majority of our discussion regarding network shares, is I'll have a server here of some kind. Now, we talked about NAS devices in a previous nugget. The NAS device could also be a server, but for our current purposes, just to make it simple, we'll think of this as something like a Windows server. For example, at this recording, the current version of server in Windows is Windows Server 2019, and it's designed to be able to store all the user accounts right here. Okay, there's my person with the hair, there's my person with the mohawk. So I got all my user accounts stored on the server, and in reality, it might be stored on another server, but the point is, there's one account that's created that we can use throughout the entire network. So I've got my computers, and they're all connected over the network to this server. Now what happens is, we create the share, maybe on this file server here, and everybody can use their existing accounts to be able to access this share. If a user's password changes, it only changes in one place. It only changes to, password 2 or whatever the password is on the server. And it's transparently aware of that change, and we don't have any access denied when they try to access that share after they've changed their password. So it's ever so slightly oversimplified here, but I just want to show you the idea there of the difference between peer-to-peer, which is not efficient, not secure, and not the best way to go, and client-server, which is much more secure. By the way, also notice that these users don't have to share their passwords with each other. And we don't have to create accounts for each user on each individual computer. They're all centralized right here. So what happens here is the central files are going to be located, like I said before, on a network-attached storage. That could be one way to do this, or on a file server, particularly in a Windows environment. And the reality is it could even be a combination of these, that you could have a file server which has the user accounts if it's also what we call a domain controller. You don't have to know that. I'm just trying to be accurate here. Or the domain controller could be a separate computer from the file server. So this is my domain controller, this is a file server, and my user accounts all over here will kind of transparently be the same user accounts that access any shares that we have over here. But again, I'm getting a little bit involved in that whole discussion. You don't have to know specifically how that works for the CompTIA IT fundamentals or for the exam. I just kind of want to make sure that I don't leave out too much because I am oversimplifying things just a little bit here. Now, there's some other advantages to using a network share, especially in a file server environment. You're going to have centralized backup. So once again, if I redraw my file server here, it's going to have a bunch of files and a bunch of folders in here with files in them, of course. And I can take that entire file server and back it up to some backup solution. It could be in the cloud, which we'll talk about here coming up as well, or it could be some kind of a network-attached storage. And it's maybe this network-attached storage device, its only job is to store backups. So everything could be stored there. It could be on some other kind of file server. It doesn't really matter. The only point I'm making here is we have a central point of backing up our files to whatever our destination is that we want to choose. Whereas if we were in the peer-to-peer environment, everybody's got their files on their own computer here. Those are supposed to be files, by the way. Looks like a boot, but I'm trying to draw folders there. Anyway, then each individual person has to be responsible for, or more likely, irresponsible for backing up their own files, and it just never really happens. And we get data loss, and we run into certain other problems too as well. Virus scans. Here, I have a central point to scan my files for viruses. Let's say that the current version of our antivirus product is version, 2.3, all right? Well, if I was in a peer-to-peer environment like I have over here on the right, this person's got version 2.1, this is 2.0, this is 2.2, and let's say that there's a new virus that only 2.2 is able to detect. And so this particular person's computer down here, they were able to detect and prevent a certain virus from infecting their computer. But these two up here, the top two computers, they didn't have the right version of antivirus quite yet, and so they got infected. Whereas if we have centralized file servers like we have over here, then I've got an antivirus product here that's up to date and is more likely to be able to squash those viruses before they get infected. Also, you have a consolidated data point. Let me get rid of my scribbles. A consolidated data point, so you have fewer scattered files, because remember, in the peer-to-peer environment, everybody's responsible for their own files, and it gets hard to track them all, and a certain user might have a file that certain other users need. It gets to be really messy really quick. But here we've got a central data point to manage everything, and we can centrally manage the user accounts. And I haven't really talked about groups yet, but that's just another way to be more efficient with how we manage things. So for example, maybe I've got, these 3 users here. I'm going to put them into a group, and then I can assign permissions to the group to a folder. This is much easier than separately applying permissions for each individual user. Instead of doing that, I just assign permissions to that one group. Now, scale this out. This is a very small group. In a lot of groups, there are thousands. Some groups, there's tens of thousands of users. Can you imagine having to assign permissions to tens of thousands of users each individually on, say, one folder or any kind of a resource? It really just can't happen. It's not scalable, and it's not efficient and practical. But instead, we can have, thousands of users in that group. Maybe that's 3,000 users, member of this group. We only have to assign permissions once to this folder. And I also have, by the way, centrally managed permissions with this. With some users, or some groups even, I might want to have only read access. So they can open the file, but they can't make any changes to it, for example. Or I might have read-write access, where those people are able to open the file and make changes and save them. And there's other more granular permissions in between those two. We also usually have better redundancies for a file share that's on a client-server environment, such as a drive failure. Normally on, some big old massive server out here that's a file server, there's a lot of things that help to make sure that this has very good uptime. Normally we strive for what we call 5 nines. Let me scratch that out. 5 nines. That means 99.99%. No, 99.999% uptime. Means only about 5 minutes per year of unplanned downtime. And one of the ways that can happen is, I might have a bunch of hard drives in here, and because of certain redundancy technologies, if one of these drives fails, then the other drive, it's going to send an alert out. A network administrator somewhere or a server administrator is going to receive a warning, hey, there's a drive that failed, but everything still works. Okay, all we have to do is to replace that one drive, and we're back in business. But even before we replace it, normally this other data here is still live and available for our users to be able to access. Several different ways of being able to make sure that can happen. The other thing that we would have here is we would have redundancies such as, what's the other thing? Power backup down here. So, if this whole thing is plugged into a wall here somewhere, and it might be in a rack, and it might be very high powered, but anyway, so it's plugged into some wall right here, and that's where we get our electricity here. But if the power goes down, then what happens? Well, normally there's things like backup generators, big battery backups. Some of the battery backups weigh thousands of pounds because there's so many batteries in them, and they're so heavy. There's all kinds of different battery and power redundancies that can take place to make sure that we still have good uptime with this server over here. So again, a lot different than in a peer-to-peer environment, where if I have just a few computers here and someone got clumsy and tripped across my power cord and disconnected me, now we're all out of luck because my power is down, my files are not available, and some files might have even gotten corrupted when that power interruption happened. Oh, my head was in the way the whole time. Here, that's what that was supposed to look like. This is the person's computer, and someone tripped over the power cord, which is right here, and it cut off the power. Don't judge me, people. My head actually perfectly matches that circle anyway. Look at that. Oh man, it's almost exactly right. Well, I think that's enough for this nugget. I've tortured you enough with my scribbles. So in the next nugget, I'm just going to actually demonstrate how we create some of those shares on a peer-to-peer environment, which again is not the best way to go, but sometimes you have to in a small office. And then I'll show you the client-server method, which is going to be much, much better. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.